So yeah, we've set ourselves this big project to essentially solve the problem of polarization this afternoon. So figuring out how we got here and more importantly, how do we get out from where we currently are? And we have this great panel with us to help us dig into all of this. And you know, while we're not going to be Pollyanna about the problems that we face, we're very solutions based in this panel. We hope to come away with some well-grounded hope and practical ideas for moving forward. And now to introduce our panel, you can find out their full bios. They're extremely accomplished people by checking out their online bios. So I'm just going to do a quick recap. Sabreena Delhon is the CEO of the Samara Center for Democracy, a nonpartisan registered charity with a mission to realize a resilient democracy with an engaged public and responsive institutions. And relevant for our panel today, she is also the host of the award-winning podcast Humans of the House, which is a great title, which explores the lived experience of former members of Parliament. Drew Fagan is a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Drew previously spent 12 years in leadership positions with the province of Ontario and the Government of Canada before becoming a public servant, and he also worked at the Globe and Mail in a number of roles, including as Parliamentary Bureau Chief. And finally, Owais Lightwala is an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, specializing in entrepreneurship, leadership, and innovation within the creative industries. And previously, he was the managing director at Why Not Theatre. Owais consults regularly for cultural organizations, including the National Arts Centre and the Toronto Arts Council. Please. So to start, I'm going to ask you kind of a shot across the bow question. We're about a month after the federal election. It seems like a good moment to reflect from where you sit on where you think Canada is at now in terms of social cohesion, polarization, openness to dialogue at this point.
Sure, I can start. So thinking about, this, it's so helpful to have that bigger historical context for PEI and where we are as a country, and then like narrowing down to the election. We saw high engagement in the election. We saw a pretty decent voter turnout, but so much of that connection was driven by fear and uncertainty and anxiety about our sovereignty, our economic future, and the strength of our democracy. And within this context is the bigger pressing challenge around how technology has been influencing our democratic culture, particularly how information threats on digital platforms, so foreign interference, online abuse, disinformation, the use of bots, have been making us feel more divided than we actually are. And the public awareness of this isn't as extensive as we would like it to be. And at the Samara Center, we've been monitoring the health of online political conversations for a couple of years, and during the election, reported on what we were seeing on Blue Sky, Reddit, and YouTube in order to help Canadians be equipped to understand how political conversations play out online. And the divisive aspect of it. So we've got this opportunity for cohesion right now, but we're up against so much in terms of polarization. And it's really important to understand that what's happening online, how we navigate these spaces, how we become more discerning, is not a matter of a few misinformed Canadians, or Canadians should just do better. Voters are up against information manipulation from people who are actively looking to undermine our democracy and our sovereignty by damaging our social cohesion. So I think in this moment we have a big opportunity for connection and cohesion, but we have to be responsive to the long tail of this challenge as well.
Thank you. Just carrying on down the line, Drew.
It's an extraordinary result that the two major parties, the true traditional parties, the two parties who have always held power in this country, center right, center left, got 85% of the vote. That hasn't happened since the 1930s. That's extraordinary at a time when you're seeing in Western democracies a real break with that tradition, which was common everywhere for a long, long period of time. So you think what's happening in Germany, with the far right in particular getting 20% of the vote in the last election, and how concerning that is in historical terms, obviously. The rise of reform in Great Britain in the municipal election that took place, a radical right-wing Brexit party coming back into dominance, and other parties, and obviously what's breaking down in the United States. So I think at this time, the sense of coalition building that those two parties played throughout our history, until not long ago when things started breaking down, maybe in the 1993 election, with reform in the West and the Bloc Québécois coming to dominate Quebec, you're seeing something that I think by and large is positive, especially because you're seeing a greater moderate voice on both sides.
I'm also the newly father of a 2-month-old, and one thing I've been thinking about is she's going to be 75 in the year 2100, I hope. She's around then, which is like an absurd age, like an absurd time. 2100 is not a year that I can imagine. I will not be here. Probably most of you won't be here, I'm sorry to say. She might be. And then looking back kind of a couple hundred years, I'm like, seems like there was a lot of polarization. Like there was a lot of conflict. There was crusades. There was Catholics versus Protestants. There was world wars, communism. It seems like conflict has not actually, it's not a new thing. And in the framing even of this discussion we're having, we're proposing something feels worse or bad as happening, and therefore we need to solve it. I'm more interested in why does it feel bad right now? Like I'm right now talking into this magic stick that somehow is taking my voice and throwing it to a thing over there, that is somehow throwing it to these things, that is somehow amplifying it. Nobody here can explain to me how this works. It's witchcraft. Like, it's a pretty amazing time. We're doing amazing things, and yet we all feel bad all the time. Like, something happened recently where we're feeling very anxious, we're feeling very stressed out, and objectively, I'm having a hard time identifying what exactly is causing that. So to me, the dialogue part is what I'm more interested in. I think the polarization is maybe, like in 2100, a thing that I'm legitimately thinking is going to happen is there's going to be polarization between the people who live on Mars and the people who live on Earth, because we'll hate those Earth people. They'll be so backwards in their like conservative ways, and the Mars people are just so much more progressive and modern, and they're not, stuck with the legacy of Earth thinking. This is going to be an actual problem that will happen then, but how do we talk to each other in that future? How do we continue to have better conversation and feel better? That's ultimately what I'm most interested in, is like, why does it feel so hard right now?
So I do want to dig into the social media question and the online spaces question about creating dialogue, because it seems like, wow, to your point, Owais, like what a great innovation that is to democratize communication, to allow us to communicate with people all over the world and so on. So I want to talk about why that seems to be so much of the problem. But just to kick it off, Sabreena, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on the study that you did and what you actually found about the influence of people in these online spaces.
One of the areas that we looked at was Canada's largest subreddit. So we looked at Reddit and we looked at r/Canada, which has about almost 4 million members. To give you a sense of how influential that is, it's very close to r/Taylor Swift. So significant. Also, it's one of the spots that you can actually share news online. And one of our findings was that when we looked during the election, it was just a small number of users that was shaping that entire conversation. It was 150 people producing comments. 14% of the comments in r/Canada were produced by 150 different accounts. And about 30% of the posts were produced by 9 accounts. So we have an audience, a community of almost 4 million, and it's being shaped and directed by 150 accounts commenting over here and 9 accounts commenting there. And this is really cause for concern, because when people are in these spaces, there can be a perception that this is reflective of public opinion. And when we decide that, well, that's where the public is at, then we start to use that information to drive polling questions and research questions and policy agendas as well. And another aspect of this is understanding how much of this content is even real, or is it something called astroturfing? AstroTurf is fake grass. AstroTurfing is fake grassroots messaging. So this is when a post appears on a platform and it looks like it's from someone who's part of a social movement or a certain community, but that's not necessarily the case. And that post can be artificially inflated through likes and reshares and boosted at a very high volume, so it shows up in as many feeds as possible. So on this topic of like, why do we feel so bad right now, and why do we kind of feel so disconnected, we're really being manipulated by a lot of material that isn't real or is out of proportion, but we're not grounded in understanding that that might actually be happening. So then this is shaping our culture, and it's shaping our individual realities too.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen?
Some of the references that Sabreena made are to bots and other artificial forms of not conversation, but information, misinformation, disinformation. Part of the challenge, of course, is us as well. And, you know, I come from a world, I spent the first half of my career, the first 20 years at the Globe and Mail, as Nora mentioned, and did just about everything there. And, you know, we have even now The Guardian as well, and Guardian used to be a great paper when we'd come and, you know, like look at it like everywhere, right? Now, part of the problem, which I think we'll get into, is the lack of effective news coverage, including especially on a local level. It's a feast every morning if you want to wake up and have access to The Guardian and the New York Times. And, you know, I go through the stuff I read. It's a feast. But you're looking for local news, including in big cities, and it's completely lacking. And there are other countries that have had a tradition of proper news coverage, balanced, fair opinion, of course, and there's an article in The Economist this week on the news media in India, particularly in the national broadcasters, and the extent to which they've been taken over by propaganda. India, which we look to as the biggest democracy. So I think about the fact that the legacy media was elitist. There had all sorts of biases, including, by the way, prejudices, and a lack of equality in the newsroom. And that goes back to even I left 20 years ago, and I can think about things that were going on in the 80s and things like that that are obviously embarrassing now. One thing we did, I mentioned this when we were talking beforehand, is, you know, even now when somebody sends a letter to the editor, you check that that's actually the person, right? You actually check. They call around. Right? I had a letter to the editor just for fun at Christmas time. They didn't call me, but they kind of know me, you know? And they call everybody. And they make sure, because all you need is one embarrassment where somebody's made up a name, and I can think of an example going back many decades that was super embarrassing because it was actually a swear word in another language, and it was politically controversial, and it got coverage. You made sure. Anonymity, the anonymity of crowds, the irresponsibility, and made worse by, you know, all the biases working into the internet that you can say in some ways the legacy media did. We want to sell paper, so we want to kick it up, but not to the degree of here in terms of the ways that opinion is encouraged that's extreme. And it's not conversation, it's opinion. And it's what's known as splitting, which is, you know, extreme left, extreme right, or strong opinions that then get turned into a megaphone. So that's some of the biases, I think, that I compare decades past with now and think there's got to be means of getting up and over that.
I think there's another interesting idea when you think about social media, this concept, I forget who to credit for, that humans have evolved to only have communities of 150 people. And this very well documented concept that we really did not evolve to ever have a tribe where we had relationships, close relationships, where we knew the names of and cared about more than 150 people. So basically about this room, right? And the technological innovation that we have, where I can now drink from a fire hose of everybody's opinions about everything all the time. Our Canada is a great example. Like, I love Reddit. Like, I use Reddit. I consult Reddit before I make any decision to buy anything, because it's other people who've actually tried something. But I would never go to Our Canada. Like, I can immediately tell that it's going to be a toxic swamp of the worst kinds of anonymous discussion. But the biggest reason I don't go there is because I don't know who you are. Like, I don't, this is not my people. And if I don't have a relationship to you, it's so easy for me to be terrible to you, and for us to not actually engage in any kind of good faith relationship. Like, this is not my joke, but social media being called such is a really bad name. It is really antisocial in the way that it breeds, rather than trying to create relationship that is beyond screaming at each other. It incentivizes, how can we get the most engagement? How can we get people the most angry? And unfortunately, the more angry you are, the more likely you are to click, the more likely you are to comment, the more likely you are to share, and then make an angry comment. I'm just as guilty of this as all of us, in that I rage read I know so much more than I want to know about what Trump's second lieutenant had for lunch yesterday and why it's a crisis. Like, I don't need to know this stuff, but I'm obsessed with it because it's infuriating, right? Everything about things that make us mad gets us engaged, and the engagement business models of these things, I think, is part of where we are the product, right? You are, unless any of you is paying for Facebook, and actually this is a true story. Facebook looked into what it would cost to have an ad-free version, and they figured out that there was no amount of money that was better than the ad revenue that they were going to get from you, that you would be willing to pay. You are so lucrative to Facebook as an engaged customer of advertising that they cannot charge you enough money for you to just use it for what it is. Because if you didn't have the ads on Facebook, you would still just be doing what you were doing 20 years ago on Facebook, where you were just like, I had lunch today, and here's a picture of my cat, and congratulations, granddaughter, on your bar mitzvah. Like, that's what it was for. And instead, it's now become an ad machine that is not actually interested in your well-being. It's interested in the well-being of advertisers.
Yeah. I'm not on Reddit because I don't know how to get on Reddit, basically.
It's free, and you don't even need an account.
It's hard being a second millennium person in a third millennium world. But I'm on LinkedIn. It's most all the time. That's my community, but it's mostly log rolling, if you know what I mean, which is, praising your friends, and there's not a lot of honesty there. I'm on Twitter and all the, whatever it's called, and X, and, I do that I'm a Bob Dylan nut. All the Bob Dylan nuts are on Twitter, but, again, the fundamental challenge is that, I think the point about advertising is a fundamental one. Where did the advertising come from? The advertising came from the legacy media, by and large, and much more beyond. So the legacy media that we do count on, with all their biases, but there's also, in certain ways, all sorts of new entrepreneurial organizations. And it's an extraordinary time for journalism in certain ways, and completely the opposite. It's a desert in others. They thrived on advertising. 80% of their revenue was advertising. Think of your Saturday or Sunday, depending, what did you call it? The classifieds. That's what paid for news reporting. And that's all gone. So some have managed to get up and over that. The New York Times has 14 million paid subscribers now. 14 million paid subscribers for a relatively elite publication that now has a global audience. That's harder to do if you're in even Toronto, let alone other parts of the country, or parts of the world in which English is not the major language, or you're publishing in other languages. So the transformation in the last 20 years is just extraordinary. And to go back to your first point, of course, there's so much out there that's making significant profit that is not just entertaining, because I like looking at dog videos. Boy, oh boy, it's a great time for dog videos. But, but that you can't trust.
there is this persistent concern that elites, if I can use that term, are out of touch with many people's actual concerns, that they're focused on performative acts, on virtue signaling, and so forth. How does that critique land with all of you? Owais?
Yes.
Would you care to expand?
It's the biggest thing. I think that when we talk about polarization, the polarization, if you look at the numbers, far more than across political spectrum. And actually, if you think about this in your own life, I see for sure a much bigger distinction between polarization of elites versus non-elites. Elites here being defined generally by very high levels of education, people who work in areas or industries that shape culture. So academics, journalists, government, big business executives. I think we have to make a big distinction between, yes, there's absolutely some manipulation, there's absolutely bots, there's absolutely bad actors, and then there's also just legitimately cranky people on the internet. And why are they so cranky? Like my uncle with his stuff on my WhatsApp family group that is unhinged, what is going on with this guy? and I think it's because he's frustrated and he is not someone like me. I can write an op-ed and it'll get published because I'm a university professor. I don't even make that much money actually, but which is an interesting thing to me, this concept of elites. We have this idea that they're all billionaires or something, but it's really just people who have agency in shaping culture. And we're in a place right now where whether you're left-wing or right-wing, I think there's a growing sense of disconnect from shaping priorities for the elites, shaping the conversations, shaping the realities, and being told constantly what are things you're allowed to talk about, think about, what kinds of conversations we're allowed to have, what the language has to be. These considerations, whether they're coming from a good place or a bad place, I feel like has made people feel excluded. And that exclusion became resentment, that resentment has become anger, and that anger is now starting to bubble over. And I think this is cross-partisan. This is not a right-wing issue of right-wing resentment, anger. There's left-wing resentment, anger. There's different shades of it, and it comes from disempowerment, a feeling of we democratize all this communication, but we have not democratized power in our society. I don't think anybody's under an illusion that we all now share the same amount of power just because we are all publishers and mini brands that can share to a global audience right away doesn't mean that we actually have any influence over how things actually, decisions that get made. And the biggest thing for me is the distraction that comes from getting stuck in the culture wars because we don't actually have good productive ways to discuss the material challenges that we have. So we have no other outlet for folks to express their sincere challenges about the fact that inequality has gone insane, that something happened with housing and nobody was paying attention to it, and a university professor is struggling to buy a house anymore. Like something went horribly wrong in our material planning, and if we don't give positive outlets, productive outlets for those discussions that are high trust and functional, then it's very easy to co-opt that anger into cultural wars, into these symbolic arguments we're having about identity ultimately, and who is a real Canadian and who's not, and who's a real this and who's not, and those, I don't know that those identity conversations have any conclusion. How will we ever conclude whether or not I'm a real Canadian or not? Like, what is the end of that discussion? There's no way out of it except conflict.
The other part of this is also that people are civically engaged and they're active citizens. They're doing everything right, but they're not getting the credit. At the end of the day, we're measuring the health of our democracy through voter turnout. But what about helping your neighbor get groceries during the pandemic and volunteering on your kids' council? What about coming together in person for things like this? Why aren't we validating that kind of stuff enough? And what is so threatening about making what the public is already doing worthy, right? And valuing it explicitly. So I think, this panel, this conference, and this moment is about reckoning with these types of conversations and finding ways for public participation that aren't passive or transactional or flat, because without doing that, the anger gets co-opted by nefarious actors, and it's really damaging for our society.
So I'm still contemplating the idea of my own chatbot A mini me. I don't like myself all that much. So I'm not sure if I want to go for this. But started with legacy media. So the legacy media, to a sizable extent, this country, the United States, did fail society. And I can think of in many ways. And that's not to say that some of the publications now, some of the reporting, as again, I think it's a feast in many ways, including, again, some of the startups, including in Canada, like technology coverage at the Logic, for example, which is making a go of itself purely through subscribers, right? That's extraordinary. Again, at a time when no publication did that 50, 60 years ago. You always depended primarily on advertising. The failure particularly was in the consensus over neoliberalism, I think, which I was, and the Globe and Mail was completely supportive. So free trade, think about trickle down in the 1980s, and the failure of that to actually build an economy in which everybody thrived. There was a sort of almost religious sensibility that change would bring benefit for everyone. And it wasn't primarily NAFTA. Some might blame the China shock. Some might blame of China becoming a global manufacturing and consumer powerhouse. Others might blame the financialization, if you like, of the economy. All these things. This was not just among conservative publications. I'm thinking now of more, magazines and things like that, but liberal publications as well. And think about Clinton through the 1990s completely accepting that agenda. And that, I think, was the start of some of the trends that we've seen that ultimately have led to the election of Donald Trump twice. So I think there was, to some extent, a failure of the legacy media with regard to that. On the other hand, we're all publishers now. We all have access to everyone. So do politicians. And politicians increasingly, because 30, 40 years ago, your premier, my premier, prime minister really couldn't talk to the public directly in an effective way. Not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes, actually, what it avoided was propaganda, because what you see to a sizable extent now in the media, which has been badly damaged economically, so you don't have the same number of reporters. I could cite rhyme and verse of the things the Globe and Mail covered in the 1980s and 1990s that it doesn't cover now. It doesn't have a correspondent in Atlantic Canada. It used to have 5 people at Queen's Park. It now has 2. All those trends, right? The work isn't done. And as a result, those leaders who are allowed now to speak to the public, as so they should, given the technology, aren't questioned in the same way. So it's always that balance between the failings of an independent media that you could trust knowledgeable of its failings and the lack of such, which leads to some of the horrible trends that we're seeing now, including obviously the technology challenges of misinformation and disinformation.
So is the problem then, because it feels like the problem is a grassroots problem. The problem is with us, that we're not able to be with people we don't agree with without thinking that they're bad people. Or is the problem that that division is being sort of weaponized by social media platforms, by politicians who find wedge issues, or maybe it's both of those?
There was absolutely politicians weaponizing our sentiments and our pathologies and our fears and our anxieties time immemorial, right? Like, this is not a new concept, and all we need to look is the World War II to see very strong evidence of people getting riled up with hatred without having any access to direct publishing or direct access to your feeds. The thing that feels different now, and in one way we made a huge progress where we have all these avenues to communicate, but I think the thing that I'm coming to right now is, like, we haven't figured out a way to gather more often. We've somehow figured out a way to isolate more often. The one thing that I will say in defense of AI chatbots, since that's come up and casually dismissed as a bad thing, is we absolutely have a loneliness epidemic. Like, make no mistake, there is old people right now who are dying of loneliness. There's young people, young men in particular, who are so lonely that they are committing violence against all kinds of folks. Like, there's a lot of issues in our society right now that there is a solution, which is some of us would have to go out and talk to, like, I should be spending more time with my mother. And I don't have necessarily the capacity to do that, but the possibility of technology helping our challenges, I don't immediately dismiss as completely a terrible idea. It will come with new challenges, of course. It will come with I've already found this, and if you are interested in this, do some Googling on, like, AI chatbots are not a future concept. This is not like Black Mirror. This is already happening. There are people who already have AI boyfriends and girlfriends. Like, that train has left the station. And it's fascinating because it's a level of reality that we were not prepared for. We have not evolved to kind of discriminate between an artificial intelligence and a real intelligence. We are completely going to fall in love with artificial intelligence. It is an amazing conversationalist. I talk to my ChatGPT several times a day, ask for lots of advice. I do so much emotional burdening onto it that I used to do to my partner, and it's helpful because some of the stuff, frankly, that I was bringing to her was, like, not her problem, and maybe I should be paying a therapist for. But the possibilities of these new ways of relating, I think, are going to be great. To go back to your question of why does it feel bad, I think there's just no way that I know of, and if someone knows otherwise, that we can fast forward our evolution to the point where we no longer need human-to-human contact. And the human-to-human contact is diminishing. Our ability to gather with folks and ideally not talk is diminishing. So where I come into all this is, I'm a storyteller. I work in the arts. And the whole kind of project of the arts is for us to gather and express ourselves. I think the worst thing we can do for our politics and our dialogue is to get together and talk about politics. The last thing we should be doing is talking more about politics. We're doing too much of that. What we should be doing is getting together and talking about, hey, neighbor, what's going on in your life? Like, the way that I can have a relationship with my parents who have completely different political opinions from me is by not talking about it. And then we can have dinner every week, and it's totally fine. We can coexist if we don't make everything, all of our entire relationship, just about this one axis of our existence, which is what is the distribution of material resources in our system, is basically what it feels like we're reducing our relationships to each other. Like, I would like to have relationships with my neighbors that are not just about what is the identity of our political affiliation and how much taxes do you want to pay. I would like to have a relationship where I care about their kids and I care about their life beyond do you want higher taxes or lower taxes, and are we going to have bike lanes or not have bike lanes? Like, I think we're reducing our humanity too much by not having more complex social relationships. But where do we do that? Churches are declining. Free spaces are closing. We have a decline in the third space outside of work and home where people can gather and just exist, just coexist together without having, even this forum is actually, sorry to say, Steve, like a contribution to that polarization, because we are here talking about the problems rather than having a good time. But I think there is a sense of, like, our approach to this feels like work. Like, we're making more work for everybody. You got to do the work and get really informed so you can participate in the discourse better. And I don't want to do that. Like, I want to have better, more fun relationships with people.
Yeah, nobody wants to do that, and we have to be responsive to it. And I get this question all the time in my job as well. How can we have difficult conversations together? And it's like, why? Because you'll just spend time with someone that you don't like because you're only going to focus on this small thing that makes you kind of just why do we have to suffer? It's such a weird moment of, in order to be a good citizen, I have to eat my vegetables and it's going to be bad, but then I'll be good. And it's so cerebral as well, and it's also so robotic. And when we do have opportunities to be together in person, there's so much more nuance and humanity that we kind of forget about when we're online, because in online spaces, you go to LinkedIn to talk like this, and then you go to Reddit to do that, and then you scream into the void on ChatGPT, so it'll be okay at home later on. And we forget that when we're in person, we don't have to do that segmentation so much. And there were a lot of big problems in our society around loneliness and inequality that were exacerbated during the pandemic when the instruction for social good was to stay away from each other. And we had to do that for a really long time, and we suffered a lot through that, and we're still suffering. And the grieving for that has not been experienced broadly. That's been an individualized and isolated experience as well. And then the coming together and healing from that also hasn't happened. And through that, as you've mentioned, Owais, we lost a lot of third spaces, spaces that we can just go to just have some form of civic connection, which is a very academic term for it, but just hang out. You don't have to buy anything. If you end up chatting about stuff, that's good. You don't have to talk about politics. You don't have to talk about the news. You're just around. And then you can find all these other ways that you have common ground, because we're certainly very hungry for it. And that's definitely where the majority of Canadians are at. Platforms are driving something called affective polarization, which makes us have this negative association towards people who we think have a different political orientation than we do, you know, even whether it's our parents or our colleagues or whatever. But when it comes to the substantive issues, we're not so far apart. Yeah. So there's a lot of common ground for us to be seizing and working on together, and that connection and humanity comes from having a good time.
Yeah.
And also important to maybe identify who benefits from the first thing you said around reducing the opportunities for people to hang out and for these conversations to continue is in the interest of the elites. Like, as someone who gets paid to be on the stage right now and talk to you, this is good for me. This is good for my business, for us to feel bad, so that you have to come and talk to me, and then you'll follow me on Twitter, then you'll subscribe to my Substack, and like, I will continue to be employed if I have this role to play. And I think that's part of our challenges. The shape of this is very much elite incentivizing.
It's one thing to be politically disengaged. In some ways, it's another thing to be politically overengaged because it's your overarching identity. And balance needs to be found, and the ability to have conversations, and actually difficult conversation. I just want to give an example that we did at the Monk School, and I didn't at U of T, and I didn't have anything to do with it, but I watched it happen on Israel-Palestine. And that is, we had, you know, it's a self-selecting group. You know, it was not hugely what people might think of as problematic, divisive. These are students in graduate school going on to professional roles in government or around government. It's self-selecting. But there was a bit of a challenge, and what we decided to do was not to have a debate over Israel-Palestine, or even bring in outside speakers with different perspectives on that. What we decided to do was bring in somebody who specializes in difficult conversations. How you actually converse on something that may be the most difficult issue globally today. And it was actually, I think, quite effective, because fundamentally what the students learned was the point of hard conversations is not agreement. The point of hard conversations is actually some degree of understanding. And they were taken through that, in which they role-played, in which they were assigned different sides of the agenda, different aspects of history, and tried to have a conversation in that context. And what was interesting is the degree to which some would say, I don't know enough about this, I shouldn't have an agenda, or those that felt even when they were role-playing to such an extent, they were being to some degree dishonest, disingenuous, and even then buying into a perspective that they actually didn't share. And it took some real work, and this is a pretty intelligent group of graduate students, as I say, to get through this. And it ultimately became, I think, pretty successful. But I go back to that line that the point wasn't to agree. And we did have disagreements in the class that's just graduating now, because it was pretty, even for us, it got a little emotional in the 23-24 academic year after the attacks of October 7th and the aftermath of the attacks in Gaza. The point isn't agreement. The point is understanding. I think we've lost that to a sizable extent. Less here than in the States. I think that's fair to say. And we saw that in an election. Compare the election of April to the election in November in the States. There is a difference now, and it's for the better.
And are there other things that you see that are like viable opportunities for opening up that discussion for how we turn this corner and get to a healthier place?
Well, I want to mention the work of two organizations, Civics and Apathy is Boring. So Civics runs a parallel vote program from elementary to high school grade levels for kids across the country. And they teach them about party platforms and how to vote. And I know all this stuff sounds so boring because it's about like the kind of more transactional vote experience I was talking about earlier. But when you get young people thinking about being active citizens early in their life, they will develop that understanding and learn about information, understand the process, but they'll also have a positive behavior change impact on the grown-ups in their lives. So kids got their grown-ups to start recycling and stop smoking, and I think they can pull us out of this period of despair and uncertainty as well. And Apathy is Boring does great programming for young people as well. And I don't want to be like, oh, it's all about the children, but like we need a generational strategy on how we secure active citizens in this country. And this generation in particular had 2 years of no school. And they are dealing with a lot, and when they are civically engaged, it does wonders for their mental health, and they already are doing a ton in terms of being active citizens. You know, young people get so much grief for not caring enough about politics the way we're talking about it, but they're busy solving problems in a more productive way with a higher standard. And so that's something I want to point to that is optimistic, and that's an area that we can take a page from as well.
Building on the young people thing, because I spend a lot of time with young people at the university, they're spending an average of 9 hours a day on TikTok, an average of more time than I spend sleeping is on, I don't even know how that's possible. But the challenge is going to get, I think, even harder with the disconnect. And we have seen like there's a decline in teenage romantic liaisons because they're spending more time on their phones and less time doing what teenagers should be doing. And I think for, you know, I'll gear my advice or my thoughts to the crowd. Like, if you can help it in any way, start a book club. You know, get a community choir going, help a local theater get off the ground, because the more places that I think we can gather in person and do something that is not talking, but making something that gives us joy, the best chance we have of actually getting ourselves out of the cycle that we're in. Because I do think there's a massive, like, I don't want the technology train to stop. By no means am I saying that we should stop the development of AIs and the internet should be banned and like all these. There's people who have these opinions because they're so terrified of what it's done to our brains and to our relationships. But I also love having my smartphone, and you will take it from my cold, dead hands. So I don't want to go backwards on technology, but I do think we need to be realistic and lucid and look directly into the face of what the technology means for us, and then also invest in, both with our time and our money and our courage, in bringing those spaces alive where people can gather and be human beings again and not have a commercial relationship to each other. I think that's going to be critical for getting that dialogue back and getting our society back in track.
I want to recommend an article that it's excellent in the New York Times today by Steven Pinker. For those of you who have had, you can see what he teaches at Harvard from Montreal. You can see you've been reading about what's happening at Harvard, the Trump administration, the action today or yesterday to try to force Harvard not to accept any international students. His long article on how Harvard actually operates and the challenges it has internally with regard to freedom of speech, of political bias, and the effectiveness of that organization even in that context. And I recommend it not just as informative about what, one of the great universities of the world, which is under particular threat, does, but actually the fact that it's a balanced perspective both on its failings over time, and the effectiveness of how much it does. It's a classic example, to my mind, of sort of really strong reporting and opinion that you don't see enough of. But you are seeing a fair bit in those publications that I actually mentioned off the start.
So when we're talking about these opportunities to be together, to have fun, to have conversations, is there a space for government there? Is there a space for grand visions like, you know, the response that we saw to the 51st state business? Or is this really, does this really need to be localized? Does this really need to be grassroots? Or can we do both?
Well, I think it has to be both. If we want informed policy responses from the government, it has to be shaped by advocacy that's from the ground up. Mm-hmm. So whether that's community organizing or just other entities, if it's not rooted in the local experience, then we're going to perpetuate this elite, oh, they think this is good for us, kind of circumstance. And it's also not something that government can just sort of walk away from. They need to be regulating these platforms in the public interest, and they need to be supporting teachers so that kids can grow up to be active citizens and know how to figure out what the next chapter for Canada is. But that's only going to be meaningful if they're listening to, if they've got informed advocacy behind that effort.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question you asked, because when I read Mark Carney's mandate letter and read the priorities in it, not a single one of them is make us feel better. Like, all of them are, and they're the things that people said that they wanted. They wanted the housing to be cheaper, and they wanted the country to be safe and not get invaded, and totally reasonable priorities to have right now for the moment we're in. But I think this is where there's a question to me of, like, I don't know whether the public needs to demand more strongly that we need a national strategy for how do we feel better. And if you're interested, I may or may not be involved in an initiative that may or may not have some solutions to this. CreateCanada.ca. But the missed opportunity of having this language that Carney came in with of visionary change, transforming the economy, transforming the country, healing the country, and facing down this very strong, real threat. I think there needs to be, at least one of the bullet points needs to be, and we have to do it together, and we have to be able to engage together, because I do think there's a massive barrier. There's a reason why people aren't gathering. Where are you going to find the real estate? The real estate is incredibly expensive, or you're not able to access it. Or even if you are able to access it, who's going to pay for the costs of running that space? Like, I think there's a role for government to play. I would hope that it's led by communities demanding it and then government following, rather than government. I can't think of a worse thing than the government saying, all right, now everybody needs to spend your 30 minutes a week in your government-mandated fun times where you go and love your neighbors. That's not going to work, obviously, but I mean, it would if it was China, but I think this is good. Like, I like having the freedoms that we have, but I don't think with great freedom comes great responsibility. We need to take seriously our own responsibility to demand from our leaders that they make space for that, and at the same time chew the gum, fix the housing, get the 5% for our military spending, protect the borders, all this fun stuff that you have to also do. They have multiple people working there. It's not just one guy. So delegate, man. Like, let's do all the things.
You know, this country's always been comfortable with a mixed economy. I said always. It's actually not true. It's relative. It came after the Depression. Before the Depression, government spending as a percentage of GDP was actually lower in this country than it was in the United States. And now, obviously, it's higher, and we lean more towards a European model. So yes, there's an expectation that government's going to have a role. I'm not sure about government subsidizing the media in terms of that role. And I can only, I don't think I have to go into that in verse, although having a strong national broadcaster, and Carney did promise more money for the CBC, is something that is a tradition from the 1930s. I'd be happy if they could actually build infrastructure effectively, and I say this as the former Deputy Minister of Infrastructure for Ontario. I solved all the infrastructure problems in Ontario. And
Ontario thanks you.
It's been moving backwards ever since. So there's only so much you can expect. I was thinking, is there an example of an institution that was built with funding from all 10 provinces, by the way, as well as the federal? I couldn't think of one. I couldn't think of one. Who built, not physically, but who funded this building? All of us, and that's accepted from, and that's been true throughout the country's modern history, right? That's absolutely accepted. It wouldn't happen in the United States.
Maybe I'll just ask you each to leave us with a little shred of hope. Is there something that you're seeing like, this is exciting to me, this is making me feel like we can carry on the momentum, something that maybe it's something you see in your neighborhood, maybe it's something you have an idea for, maybe it's a call to action for people in the room today?
You know what, I think that what's exciting in this moment is that we have a very careful and modest culture in Canada, and what I'm really excited about is the potential for there to be courage and ambition about what comes next for this country, what comes next for our democracy, and drawing on that to serve as a model on the world stage for what a healthy democracy can look like, one that's responsive to the challenges of the 21st century. We don't have to dwell on how we haven't had it perfect to date. We get a fresh page right now. So how can we make the most of it? I find that really, really hopeful. And this is a weird one. The Samara Center has been around for 18 years, and when it began, people were like, what's the problem? Democracy's fine. And it would take a long time to explain the purpose of the organizing. Oh, you got to take care of things that are important. But now when I just say the name of the organization, people are like, oh, good. And I hope that leads to greater value, investment, and engagement with the civil society sector more broadly. Because the kind of work that we're talking about happening is done by actual people, and it should be funded properly, and it really does matter. And so I think in this moment there's an awakening, and I think that's encouraging.
I feel like one of the things that we're starting to maybe realize collectively as a consciousness is that democracy had, I don't know why people got this idea, but there was a sense of linear progress to it, and that we were at some point going to finish. We were going to be done, we were going to solve all the problems, and then we would be fine, and now we could relax and just get on with our lives. And it's, I don't think it's a bug, I think it's a feature that all democracy is just we're forever in conflict, because to actually take all that conflict out of it is a totalitarian regime, and there are some examples of those in the world. I don't want to live there. There is no conflict though, like there's no discussion, there's no dissent, there's no arguing. So depending on your definition of what a good life is, those options are available to us, and maybe we will have a referendum on that at some point. But the capacity to sit in our discomfort, in our disagreement, for me, like I am doing that on a daily basis in my own family, and I just feel like it is possible. But I do think you need to break bread with people if you're going to have very, very deep disagreement with them. That's the only way for us to keep staying engaged in relationship, in love, and then everything else is possible from there.
And it puts us in a very difficult position, say the degree to which this province, the Maritimes, Central Canada, depended on the United States relatively early with regard to our standard of living to a remarkable extent. So our concern is well placed with regard to the arc of what's happening there, but we're not facing quite the same pressures. So I don't think it's a crisis, but I do think that it's something that needs tender, loving care here. And I'm glad you're part of it.
So thanks very much to our panel. That was a fascinating discussion.